Okay, next I want to talk a little bit about political geography and remind you of a few concepts, the concepts of states and nations. And it's kind of a little unfortunate because in the US, we think of the state as a smaller political entity like California, but technically the term means a country, you know, so we have to call them countries because states would be confusing. But what we typically call a country like United States, Mexico, Brazil, what have you, is considered a state in global political terminology. These are areas that have sovereignty. A government controls and rules supreme within, you know, they are the main control, like the federal government would be of the United States. A different concept is one of a nation. And a nation refers to a cohesive group of people that may or may not have a state. They don't, it's less a political thing and more of a cultural thing. And so one reason why we're introducing this is we're going to see a good example of a nation that doesn't have their own state in a moment. But I think it's probably helpful to, if we're talking about the political geography of this part of the world, it's probably helpful to step back and talk a little bit about an entity called the Ottoman Empire. It originated in a small area in Turkey, but then expanded historically to where at its peak in the 1500s, it extended far into North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and even into parts of Europe. However, it did kind of lose some of that territory over time. However, before World War I in the 1920s, it was still a decent-sized empire. It included what's now Turkey, countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, parts of Saudi Arabia, pretty big area. However, it was on the losing end. It fought in World War II and was on the losing end. And much of this territory in green here ended up being divided among colonial powers like France and Britain and Italy. So this is kind of showing that Ottoman Empire in World War I. By that time, during a time called the Scramble for Africa that we'll talk about, the French and Italians and British had taken over much of North Africa. However, there was still this large empire in what we generally call the Middle East, called the Ottoman Empire. Make this a little bigger so we can see. And however, after World War I, because the Ottoman Empire was on the losing end, they only got to retain what is now modern-day Turkey. Turkey is kind of the last remnant of the Ottoman Empire. And Mesopotamia, which is now Iraq, Transjordan, which is now Jordan, and Palestine were controlled by the British. Syria was controlled by France, and the parts of the Arabian Peninsula gained independence. So this is in around, I believe, 1900, post-World War I. This is what the situation looked like, where, point being, many European powers had control over much of the North Africa and Southwest Asia, with the exceptions of Turkey, Persia, and parts of the Arabian Peninsula, which were independent. Now, one thing I'll highlight here is this is the language map that we looked at earlier. We have the Iranian languages, including the like Farsi or Persian in Iran, which is a big one, but also number 16 here. If we look at 16, you can see that it's in part of Turkey, it's in part of Iraq, it's in part of Iran, a little tiny bit in Syria here. That is the Kurdish language. So we have this language that kind of overlaps these different countries. And these are the Kurds, and the Kurds are the largest stateless nation, meaning that they are a nation, a cohesive group of people that identify as such, but they don't have their own country. This kind of shaded area here shows what some people refer to as Kurdistan, or the land of the Kurds. However, they don't have their own state or country. So the Kurds live in parts of Turkey, parts of Iran, parts of Iraq, and parts of Syria. And this can lead to complicated situations. So for example, the Kurds in Turkey are seeking independence. And so Turkey doesn't want this, considers them as kind of insurgents or terrorists. But then on the other hand, in Iraq and in Syria, the Kurds have been an ally of the United States on the war on global terrorism in the past. And so Turkey is an ally of the United States and NATO, but we're also allied with groups that Turkey is opposed to. So it can lead to a very complicated situation. Another unique and kind of other complicated situation is the creation of modern Israel. So this didn't happen, this happened more recently. It was after World War II. If you recall, the World War II, that this is when the Holocaust occurred, where in Europe and elsewhere, Jewish people who had been dispersed from their traditional homeland were killed by the millions. And while there were ideas of having a Jewish homeland before World War II kind of really sped the process along. So this is an area, part of the former Ottoman Empire, that was administered by the British. It was old British Palestine. And after World War II, there were plans drawn up, because there were people living here, right? So there were plans drawn up to divide this into two states, called the two-state solution. An Arab state called Palestine, and this is the original plan here in yellow, and a Jewish state called Israel. However, that didn't, that was the plan, but it didn't stay that way. There was a series of wars that took place where the Jewish state of Israel expanded their territory, and sometimes initially into other neighboring countries as well, but also controlling the Palestine, and also, and expanding and shrinking where the Arab state as well. It's all a very complicated situation. I'm going to include some videos that explain that a little better. But this is another unique situation where you have people, and many of the people in Israel, the Jewish state anyway, are people who migrated from other parts of the world, like in Europe and other places. So it is kind of a unique situation here. A little hard to we could have a whole class on this one, so I'm going to include some explainer videos. I think that'll help. But just to kind of show you, this is the West Bank. This is part of the original Palestine. It's kind of shrunken back over time. And where the situation gets complicated is that the West Bank, while it's supposed to be Palestinian, part of the Arab state, there are incursions of Jewish settlers into these. There are settlements that are inside the area. Yeah, they're kind of fortified and protected. There's other kind of expansion of people who were part of the Israel or Jewish state are kind of slowly expanding into the neighboring Arab state of Palestine. This one being the West Bank. There's two parts to it. There's the West Bank and the Gaza Strip over here. And in the West Bank, there's this includes the city of Jerusalem, which is kind of shared between Israel and Palestine. All right, so again, we talked about, one thing that we mentioned is that by the end of World War I, that European countries controlled much of this part of the world, with the exceptions of Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, which gained their independence earlier on, that European countries controlled much of it. But this kind of fell apart over time. So, for example, in the 50s, Morocco became independent, Algeria in the 60s, and so by the, around the late 60s, 70s, these, rather than being controlled by European countries, became independent entities. And many of them were ruled by dictatorships, very, authoritarian, strongman dictators, which kind of, ruled often very harshly over many of these countries. And in around 2010, you had this sort of massive uprising called the Arab Spring, that it started in one place, and we can call this a diffusion of unrest that spread throughout the region. This is a guy named Mohammed Wazizi, and he was a fruit vendor who was being shaken down for money by local, I don't remember the exact story, but he was being treated unfairly by the local government officials, and he finally got so fed up that he went out in the street and lit himself on fire. And that fire was almost literally the spark that really started unrest in Tunisia, and then and so why does this happen now and not earlier times? 2010 is when we have the early days of Twitter, Facebook. So information about this unrest could spread virally and very quickly to neighboring countries, and that's what happened. You had the overthrow of leaders in Tunisia, in Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and some countries where the leaders really, came in with military force to stop the unrest. You had extreme civil war, such as in Syria and also in Iraq. So this is the situation we have now. You have the Arab Spring happen, but you have different results in different places. You have a fairly decent democracy in Tunisia, where it originated, but then you have all the way down to really a bloody civil war in places like Syria and Iraq. And when we talked about migration into Europe, a lot of that has been fueled by unrest in places like Libya and Syria and elsewhere. One group that emerged during this, talking about kind of stateless actors, is the Islamic State, or what was called ISIS or ISIL or Daesh, which is an Arab acronym for it. And this really evolved out of the insurgency during the US war in Iraq. And the insurgents that were fighting the US and Iraq kind of went into, when Syria had a whole lot of unrest, they kind of made their way into Syria and really started to expand their forces and come back. And they extended a whole lot of control over territory in Syria and Iraq. They called themselves a caliphate, or what's called an empire based on Islamic law, kind of like the idea of the Ottoman Empire of old. So this is showing territory that was held by the Islamic State. So these are areas where the local governments in Iraq and Syria didn't have control, that they were actually expanding trying to kind of create their own state within other states. And their expansion included into Kurdish areas as well. And this is one reason why the United States and their own Kurdish militias were allied during this time, because the Kurdish were trying to protect their own homes from the Islamic State, where the US was in fear of them because of terrorism. So the Kurdish people and the people in the Kurdish areas allied with the United States to try to fight back against the Islamic State. And this is kind of the expansion of them, kind of at their height, but over time they were kind of repelled, and once the countries with support from the United States kind of got their act together, they were kind of the territory has been retaken. But anyway, with that being said, this is a figure from the region called the Middle East, and you can see there's a lot going on here. We have both Shiite and Sunni religions. We have the Kurdish area that overlaps countries. It's kind of a busy, there's a lot of things going on there. And it can be a complicated place, because while we see these outlines of countries, you have other things happening, like the presence of Kurds in these different countries. You have these, insurrections, civil wars, where different groups are seizing territory. And so the situation would be quite complicated and quite messy. I think rather than continue to discuss it, I think it would be better if to include some explainer videos. And these conflicts have also caused the flight of people into places like Europe as well, as mentioned. And one other aspect, and it's more economic geography, but I think it's probably, this might be a good place to include it, is oil. That oil is an important natural resource in this part of the world, but it's not always evenly distributed. Where you have the most intense oil resources is around the Persian Gulf. And this is where you have, this is big oil. So for Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, they have major oil resources. You do also have oil to a lesser extent in North Africa and some other places, but the massive amount of oil is really around the Persian Gulf. Then you also have some countries like Jordan, which are just kind of missed the boat. They're not really, their territory doesn't really land in any of these places that have oil. So they really don't have much to speak of, oil to speak of. Point being is that not every country here has oil. Now, one thing I want to note here, because we talked about the United States, how fracking has become, how the United States became a major oil supplier. In the Middle East, it's they have more naturally occurring oil in very thick layers. So it's much easier to get the oil out in the Middle East than it is in the United States. The United States had to be kind of creative and tricky by using fracking. And so at one time, the US was not a major player when it came to oil in the world, but it was dominated by the Middle East. But that's changed over time due to fracking. So really, Saudi Arabia, United States, and Russia are kind of the big three oil producers. And many of the oil producing countries in this realm were part of OPEC, which stands for the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. Not all, there are also some in South America, like Venezuela, and also in parts of Africa as well. So just to recap, do all countries have oil? No. For example, Jordan is an example of a country that does not have. So oil is not evenly distributed, and not even in a country. Some have, for example, Saudi Arabia has lots of oil resources on the Persian Gulf side, but less so on the Red Sea side. And another geographic concept kind of unique to this part of the world is the concept of choke points. And what these are kind of small gaps between these inland seas. So for example, the Persian Gulf, there's a small gap called the Strait of Hormuz, and these choke points are places where countries could exert leverage in a military situation. So for example, when the United States and Iran are in conflict, historically one thing they've threatened to do is to close the Strait of Hormuz. And at first you might think, well, so what? What would that mean? And what it would mean is that oil tankers could not get in and out of this Persian Gulf, where much of the world's oil is produced. And so some of the impacts of oil, you have transformation of kind of these big modern cities like Dubai in the Persian Gulf. But there's a lot of variability that the income from oil can go up and down. Oil prices can fluctuate quite a bit. This has been true in Russia as well. The United States has been less impacted by that because we have a more diversified economy. But if you have a country where oil is the primary part of your economy, you can have a situation like in Venezuela where you have highly fluctuating an economy. There's also regional disparities. So in Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of difference between living on the coast and living in the interior. It also boosts a lot of migration, that a lot of people move into these areas from Pakistan and other places, or even internally to work in the oil fields. And so some of these smaller countries in the Persian Gulf, they have a lot of what they call foreign guest workers from places like Pakistan or other countries that come in to work in the oil fields because there's not enough people locally to do so. And another part of the side effect is what's called fragmented modernization, that in much of this part of this realm, you have a mix of both modern rich and traditional or poor. So The effects of the oil are not uniform. They tend to be concentrated in places around the Persian Gulf. And as you get outside of that area, you can have a much different situation. It's fragmented modernization rather than uniform modernization.